We're gonna straight hand it over to Itai Capsouto. I'm just gonna say a few words, and then Itai, you can really present yourself and start your our closing shiur. Itai has been walking with me in this building up this institution. He lives in Hanaton, has 2 children, and he's been here for the last, I think, 8 or 9 years. And we're building this institution for the last 9 years. And he's been heading our pre-army program, or Mechinat Hanaton, until this year. He's now the educational coordinator. He teaches history and is a tour guide for many, many years, and has a special talent doing incorporating adults and adolescents with special needs in leadership programs, and also working with staff and staff dynamics, and how to promote people that are part of an intentional group or intentional community, and also making sure that that group includes everybody in the picture and not only the kind of the strong people. So I've said too much already. Itai, bama shelcha. Itai, אתה mute.
Shalom, everybody. Thank you for hosting me here. I'm gonna, first of all, do people need a break? It was kind of like 2 hours long session, no? Or should I just continue?
אולי יאיר עוד פה, שישיר לנו עוד שיר.
Okay, so I'll just jump in. I'll just jump in the deep water. So I'm gonna share my screen for a second. Just a second. Wait. Okay. Okay. Wait. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to start by saying that I would like to dedicate this session to a friend of mine who called Nir Cohen, and Nir was a good friend of mine. We grew up together. We were good friends. We were good friends, not day-to-day friends because we lived far away, but we were in the same youth organization called Chugei Siyur, and we hiked together once a month for a weekend, and sometimes 4 days straight. And we had like a really good relationship, good friendship, and I remember him very well. I remember a lot about Nir. Actually, this discussion that we're going to have now is about memory and history, and about maybe the gaps between memory and history. And I'm kind of, every time I think about this topic, I remember Nir. Why do I remember Nir? Because, as I said, I remember Nir well. I remember him as like a really sweet guy with a golden heart. And I remember him as a guy with kind of an awkward humor guy. Like he had a good sense, he had a sense of humor, but usually it didn't fit the rest of the participants, which made like kind of awkward scenes. He had a big lack of confidence. He wasn't at all like certain of himself in any situation. He was a guy that always walked with a guitar on his shoulder, but knew how to play 2 songs. But what I do remember is, I remember like great experiences that we had together, and I remember a lot of deep talks that we had. Nir tragically passed away and died in the war in 2006, the Second Lebanon War. And right after his death, there was he died the day before his birthday, and on the first year we all came to the funeral and stuff. But the year afterwards, I used to come. He's buried in Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, so I used to come to his grave twice a year, usually in Memorial Day and in his memorial service. And what I remember from these services is that people told a different story from what I knew about Neil. Like we're talking about a different person. We're talking about someone else. And it kind of like shook my foundations of what I think I know or what I think I knew about him, because they would tell stories that portrayed like a different person, different personality. Even, I would say even completely different, sorry. Completely different personality. And it was kind of weird for me. Afterwards, I would talk with a few friends, and they said that they kind of think the same as I do, that the stories that are being told are a bit different, that are a bit changing what we remember of him. Now, that's a good question. I don't know what is memory. I don't know exactly how you measure memory. If my memory is good or is it not good, their memory is better, I have no idea. But there were gaps between memories of people from Neil. And it kind of, it put me in a uncomfortable spot with myself. Later, a few years later, I started learning history in university. And learning history, one of the teachers, I had a great professor called Dr. Moti Golani, a huge historian. He said to us, the way to reach history, like the way to reach what really happened, has to go through collective memories, has to go through narratives. Because when you try and study history, you go through people's stories or diaries, or you interview people about what they remember from the past. What they tell you is not, obviously, it's not accurate history. It's their interpretation of what happened. And you have to go through that in order to understand what happened. You can't, there's no bypassing that. And that's something that opened up something with me, because it kind of made me rethink everything that I think that I know of my past, or I think I know of our collective memory, or Judaism's collective memory, or Zionism's collective memory. Plus, when you study history in university, you suddenly see the huge differences between high school history in Israel and academic history. I'll give you one example here, that when you study in high school in Israel, when I was in high school, you would be taught that the British mandate government in Israel didn't like Zionism. It wasn't pro-Zionist, it was pro-Palestinians. That's the kind of a narrative that you get, not only in history classes, but also in when you on field trips, and when tour guides tell you historical stories and stuff. But then when you reach the university and you study about the British mandate period here in Israel, then you study that, well, it's kind of different. It's not, you can't really say that academically, that the British were pro-Zionist or not pro-Zionist, because they weren't pro anyone which is not British. They were pro-British. And plus like the stories that I remember were not at all similar to what I learned in university later. I think like if you look at the pictures here, then the thing about memory and collective memory and narrative is that it's your personal way to interpret reality. You see things, and things fit like a puzzle. Everything you see fits like a puzzle to an idea you have, or to a memory, or to a collective idea, or to a collective memory you have. That's your specific way to interpret reality. And sometimes there are personal narratives, but sometimes there are collective narratives or collective memories. One good example here is one of the biggest, I would say, conflicts that I dealt with in university. When you study in Israeli high school about the waves of immigrants or waves of aliyot coming from Europe, Eastern Europe, and later on from Arab-speaking countries, you study as if you study it as aliyot, like first aliyah, second aliyah. I'm sure these words aren't strange meaning to all of you guys. You probably know as much as I do. But the word aliyah was not used in the first aliyah and not in the second aliyah. It was it's like it started in the end of the third aliyah, and the division between first aliyah and second aliyah is from way later. So if you would go back in time and talk to someone in 1904, he wouldn't have known that he was an oleh, and he wouldn't have known if he was from the first aliyah or second aliyah, which makes it like a good question of why we study it like that. Maybe we should call it waves of immigrants, or maybe it wasn't waves, maybe it was just one big wave. But there's obviously politics behind why they call it first aliyah and second aliyah, etc. And more than politics, what interests me is that how accurate is it to call them olim if they didn't call themselves olim? Like maybe, like when we study about olim, what we study about is like the picture you see on the screen on the right side, like pioneers, agriculture workers, working the land, drying swamps, and with a shovel on their hand and on the shoulder, and working very hard. But how many of these waves of immigrants were actually doing that? And how many of them were bankers, tradesmen, people that worked in factories, people that, worked with documentation, etc. And when you look at the real numbers, then you see that the pioneers, or which you could call them olim, because the word aliyah is a word that describes meaning to an action. Like the actual word is immigration, but when you give meaning to that action, and some of them may have done it themselves, you would call it as aliyah, because aliyah is like transcending to a higher place, to a greater place. It's coming from a low place to a higher place. It's aliyah laregel, aliyah leYerushalayim. So some of them maybe they were olim, maybe all of them were olim. So when you look at the numbers, you see that we're talking about something like about 10 to 15% of the first aliyah and second aliyah were actually like agricultural pioneers like that, like actual olim, the way I described them, or the way were described to me in high school. And the rest were not. That doesn't mean that they weren't Zionists. They probably, a lot of them were Zionists, but they were a typical immigration society, like immigrant society, living in Yafo and Tiberia and Tel Aviv. When you think about it, obviously, like the entire kibbutzim, they couldn't live without cities, without people that give them services, without banks, and it was all there. It was all there. Like the entire society was there. What we learn in high school is about 10 or 15% of the entire society. Which also, when I remembered it, I was thinking to myself, wow, that's interesting. Like, why do you learn about only 10 or 15%? Why is that? And even, at some point I asked my father, I think is here somewhere. My father is from Egypt, and he came to Israel in 56. So one time, about 10 or 15 years ago, I asked him if when they came to Israel, did they come out of Zionist aspirations or goals? And he said, no, not really, because they weren't like a Zionist family from before. They were more like immigrants, or even I would say refugees of a war. They had to leave Egypt. So parts of the family went to New York. They went to Israel because they had an uncle here who promised to help them out, to take care of them. And I'm glad that it was that. But the word olim still exists. Like every person that comes to Israel, Jewish person that comes to Israel is an oleh, right? So maybe it's wrong to call them oleh. Maybe we need to, because what happens when you erase their meaning? You erase a part of history, and you will never know that story. Because if everyone will learn just about the olim, then what about the rest? Is it fair? I don't know. I'm not sure, and that puts me in a spot there. There's a lot of ways to create collective memories. Here's a few examples. And I want to say that I don't think it's wrong or anything like that to create collective memories. I don't think it's bad. I just like looking at the reality and trying to understand it. We'll start with the picture on the left side down, a map of the world. And one of the questions that always comes up is what's in the center of the map? Because the world is round. So a center of a ball could be anywhere. Ellipse could be anywhere. You could start it in any place. You could start in Russia or in Canada or in Alaska or Australia. But it's always, the center is always Europe. When you look at maps, if you look at Google pictures and you look at globes, and maps is one way to like try and, create reality. Another way is like the public area, and that starts on the left and up, like the gateway to New York, the Liberty, the Statue of Liberty, which everyone in the world knows what that is. And when you come to New York, you won't miss it. And the value of liberty is a huge value in the United States. And obviously there's good meaning for it. It has to be something that you can't ignore. On the right side up, what you see is, I'm guessing some of you know this, if in Berlin and other places in Germany, on the pavement, on the street next to old houses that used to belong to Jews, there's a plaque and the name and the dates, and where were they shipped to during the Second World War. And it's an attempt to keep that in the collective memory, to not forget it. And on the right side down, you see the Seder of Pesach, which is Seder of Pesach is like an amazing, it's the Jewish holiday of memory, I would say. And this is from like a picture from this year, which we were all in Seder in Zoom or in other applications. But what you see is that like Passover, more than I do about the Passover Seder, which is like an interactive, experiential, educational experience, it's supposed to be. I don't know if it still works like that, or it's kind of, I don't know if young people still connect, but basically it's about remembering, in every generation has to see itself as if he himself set foot from Egypt. And it's a holiday of memory. It's a holiday of Jewish memory. There's no discussion about facts in Passover. Nobody asks, did it really happen? Are there archaeological proofs or whatever? Because it doesn't matter. It's not the issue. The issue is collective memory. The issue is an identity. The issue is what we make of our religion and our tradition. Another two good examples of how we create collective memory is names of streets, settlements, mountains, river streams. On the left side, what you see is a document from the naming committee. From the 1930s, there was a naming committee in Israel, and they had like huge maps, and they knew the history of Israel, the history of the Bible, the history of the Second Temple period, and the Mishnah, etc. And they knew they were geographers, and their job was to name places. Some of the places had names, some of the places didn't have names. This document here is an example from Jerusalem about neighborhoods that had an early name, and now they changed the name of the neighborhood to to more of a Hebrew name. For example, you see on the left early name Musrara, and on the right hand you see that the name of the neighborhood is going to be Morasha. Katamon would become Gonen. Bak'a is to become Geulim. The German colony is to become Emek Refaim. Now, some of the names are still kept. Like Musrara is still, when you ask a person from Jerusalem, they won't know the name of the neighborhood Morasha, but they will know Musrara, and Katamon is still Katamon. but it's definitely an attempt to create reality, like Caesarea, which is a name of a huge city that you couldn't ignore, that was built in honor of the Caesar. And on the right-hand side, you see another horrible example, a very embarrassing one, of Trump Heights. I don't know how many of you guys know this, but about a year ago, I think, Bibi Netanyahu, to honor Donald Trump, it's a settlement in the Golan Heights that wasn't very successful. Only about, I think, about 7 or 8 families still live there, and he recreated it as Trump Heights. It's formal, everything. That's what it's called now. It's going to be on the maps, and it's going to be like that for a long, long time, I think. And it's an attempt to, bring something inside the narrative, bring something inside the discussion. Maybe right now there's criticism about it, but in a few generations, it will be just a part of reality. The thing about narratives and communal narratives or collective memories is that, first of all, I think, and that's something that I think is worthwhile saying, because I think it's a good thing, that it it gives you meaning. Like, for everything that you see in the public realm or in the streets or while you're hiking or while you're walking, everything you see is a piece of a puzzle, and everything is supposed to click together to create a picture, and that picture gives you meaning. That picture is your identity. And on one hand, I think it's a good thing. It's even a great thing. And I wouldn't like to live in a place that doesn't have any mention of identity ever. And when you walk in the streets of Israel, in every city, the names of the streets match the things you studied in history, matches stories you know, matches like events that are yours. That it's your like it's an experience. When you hike in the desert and you go to Nahal Tzin, and the tour guide, by the way, I was a tour guide for a few years, and when the tour guide puts out the Bible and tells you a story about Nahal Tzin, when the people of Egypt moved in Nahal Tzin, and you're there, it moves you. It's a part of your heart now. It's not just something you know. It's a part of your identity. It's who you are. And I think it's a really good thing, by the way. I think it's even great. And I think, if I go back a bit, that the decision to connect Memorial Day and Independence Day for following days is another idea. It's an idea. And it's an interesting idea. I don't know how many other countries have that kind of like discussion inside. But it's an idea, and it has meaning, and it gives you identity. The idea between Memorial Day and Independence Day is when I looked it up and I started learning about it, I saw like the government's decision from 1951. And in the government decision, there's a quote from Bialik's, one of the songs of Bialik, "Bemotam tzivu lanu et hachaim." In their death, they commanded us to live, or life, which I think is first of all, it's a very moving quote, and it's a great quote. But obviously there is meaning behind it. And I think you can't ignore it. Like, everyone in Israel feels it. The passage between the saddest day of the year for a lot of people, the saddest day of the year, and then in about 10 minutes, you're supposed to be like joyful, happy, and thankful. It puts you in a place that you can't detach these things together. It gives meaning to the Memorial Day. It gives hope. It gives structure to everything. You can't ignore it. You can't ignore it. I think it's like when you live in Israel, the Memorial Day and the Independence Day is like, you can't have one without the other. It's a part of the same story. There's a good question about the memorial of the Holocaust Day, by the way, which is a week before, but it's still a part of a story, but it's still separate in a week. So in one hand, if I would try and summarize, in one hand, I personally accept the narrative, and I even love it. I think it's a great narrative. On the other hand, I think it's, and when I go back to Nir Cohen from the beginning of the lecture to my friend, I think about Nir and I come to the services and I hear what they say about him, and I think to myself, is it fair to say things that aren't really like accurate about him? If he was there, would he be happy with what people are saying about him? It's not bad things, it's great things, but would he feel okay with it? Would he feel okay that they're glorifying him in a way that he would never, ever do about himself? Is it okay? Like, would he like it? I don't know. And another thing that comes in mind is that I would love to know, coming back to the Aliyot story, if my history is based on 10 or 15% or even on 30%, I would want to know what the rest of the 70 was. I would really want to know why they came, why they thought of this as a good idea, how they felt about Israel back then. Did they see themselves as pioneers or not? Like, what was their job? Like, to forget them seems unfair for me. It seems like it's kind of betraying their memory. And another thing that comes in mind is the discussion we have today about fake truth, fake news. Usually fake news is not something that somebody just made up out of nowhere. Usually it's based on some fact, and you make that fact you make a whole narrative out of that fact, and you give it out to people, and some people buy it and some people don't buy it. But we all know how fake news is a problem. Specifically now during the Corona period, you see it even more, how much that's a huge problem. And I hate the idea that you never know what's truth and you never know what's fake truth, and you always need to ask yourself again and again and again. There's no credibility. But I'm asking myself if knowing only narrative, knowing only your collective memory maybe it's kind of like fake history sometimes. Maybe it's not, maybe it is. I'm not sure, but I think that there's a good question mark there, and for me it's a big question mark, because every time I read news, I think, where does it come from? What's the map of interests behind this news story? And as well, every time I read a history book or read a memory or a journal from the Independence War or whatever, I think, who's that person? What does he want to say to me? What's behind the meaning of the story? And what's not there? And I think we all need to kind of open our eyes to that. I think when I think about Nir Cohen, then it really kind of hits me hard, but on day to day as well. And this is a graffiti popped up a few weeks ago in Tel Aviv. In Tel Aviv, it's called, I'll translate it, Tray. It's called Tray. It's about the silver platter of Natan Alterman that I think you talked about before. The silver platter. I want Alterman to come over with his silver platter, and on it lies meaning. And it's a good, this graffiti is an interesting graffiti, because the silver platter is meaning. Like that's the Natan Alterman has meaning. What he did is created meaning for, the silver platter is the meaning. But I think what it does is it kind of reopens the question, because maybe they're talking about today and not 1948. Like, what's the meaning of sacrifice today? Of what's the meaning of serving the army today? So I think a lot of people are like maybe their foundations are a bit shook in the past few years about joining the army, about how, serving the army, about what the limits of being a moral soldier, etc. And what's the meaning? And I think I'll end with this. Right now we're in a period, and I think it's a good, basically, it's a good thing that you can try and think about your own story and not just about your collective story. You can examine things, you can read, you're smart enough, everyone today, and smart enough to understand their own story within the collective story, understand their own narrative within the collective narrative, think for themselves and not let other people think for you. And in our programs, we try and encourage all of the participants for critical thinking, which I think is one of the main bases of education today, as I see it, or humanistic education. And critical thinking is a kind of a, I think the right term is a double-edged sword, because it could go back to you. When you teach 18-year-olds before their army service about critical thinking and you open their eyes, the next question could be, so why should I join the army? And you are a pre-military mechina. That's your entire goal, is to get better soldiers in the army or better citizens in Israel, into Israel. And it's a double-edged sword, but I think it's the respectable thing to do as an educator. Because if you don't do that, if you don't give them the gift of critical thinking, then what you're doing is that you're trying to get them to think the way you think. You're trying to get them to think what you want them to think. And they're too smart for that. Maybe it'll work for a few months, maybe it'll work for a year, but eventually they'll figure it out and they'll remember exactly that. So this is kind of a story of my journey between, so we'd go back to these big words: history, narrative, collective memory, and every time Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut brings me back to the same questions, to the same dilemmas, to the same conflict, and makes me recreate my own story or tell my own story myself. That's it. Thank you very much. If there are questions, I'd be more than happy to. I'm here.
Itai, I just want to say thank you very much. It was, for me, extremely interesting. Also to hear what you said, and also the way that you portrayed the picture is very helps us listen to your words. Yeah, I think that we're entering. We're just going to read this Shabbat, Achrei Mot Kedoshim, and we know that we're combining Achrei Mot Kedoshim Emor, these three parashot. Achrei Mot Kedoshim this week, next year Emor, and Achrei Mot Kedoshim Emor, after, I don't know how to say them in English, but Achrei Mot Kedoshim Emor, we can read it different ways. We could say Achrei Mot Kedoshim Emor, or Achrei Mot Kedoshim Emor. And we could, after people leave this world, if they are important people or saints, if you may, you have to talk about them and you have to give them life in this world because they built this world. Or Achrei Mot Kedoshim Emor, that after people leave this world, just say good things about them, or say very good things about them. So how do we speak about people? But I want to go back to this whole discussion is also how do we speak and how do we talk about not only people but about this great idea of what we're dealing here, what we're building here. Do we talk about it in terms of sanctity, in terms of dreaming, or do we talk about it? Do we let people be cynical about it and talk about the mundane life and the dangers in every direction? So I think we started with Rachel Korazin, really portraying the picture about Natan Alterman, Magash HaKesef, to the panel that talks about Israel today, and ending with Itai that went back to Magash HaKesef. that asks for meaning again. So before we're going to say a blessing, I just want to say that, our in Chanaton, our really Zionism, if you may, our quest is really dealing with the question of who we are in the sense of private people, in the sense of a nation, because we know that a person without an identity is lost in this world. Doesn't matter where he comes from. And a society also with no identity is also kind of searching its way. I think we do have an identity, but I think these generations are definitely trying to shape it. And I think this is the most important question for us. So before we end, in Israel, we already left Yom HaAtzmaut. It's night now. It's about almost 11 o'clock. But in the United States, you are in Yom HaAtzmaut, B'itzumo shel Yom HaAtzmaut. So I want to thank Rabbi Ravin for being here with us. And maybe you could, we say there's a prayer for Yom HaAtzmaut. You could just say the part that we kind of give presents for Yom HaAtzmaut and hear from you.
Sure. So this is what I have in my Siddur. Mishas anisim lavotenu v'ga'al otam me'avdut l'cherut hu yig'al otanu b'karov v'kabetz nidachenu me'arba kanfot ha'aretz chaverim kol Yisrael v'nomar Amen. Achenu Beit Yisrael shma'u hayom mal'u 72 shana l'atzmut medinat Yisrael. Our fellows, the people of Israel, listen up. Today marks the 72nd anniversary of the State of Israel's independence. May God's name be praised now and forever. Amen.
Amen. Mazal Tov. Thank you for being with us. We hope we hope you got out of this learning some food for thought and some wisdom from Chanaton and from Agudat Israel as well. אז תודה רבה ולילה טוב.
לילה טוב.
לילה טוב לכולם. טוב לראות אתכם.
לילה טוב לכולם.